I welcome you to this last public meeting of the Westchester Rent Guidelines Board to determine rent guidelines in Westchester County for leases commencing or being renewed between October 1st, 2019 and September 30th, 2020. At this meeting, the board will hear testimony from the landlord, from the owners, and the tenant, followed by a rebuttal for those presentations. And then we will take a break, and then we will proceed to the final vote. I have to remind the public that this is a meeting for the board, so although you are welcome, your presence is more than welcome, you are not allowed to participate. I will now, I have to announce also that Jean Anderson is still recuperating at home, so she won't be able to be with us today. I will now take roll. Please respond if you are present. Velene Acquah?
Yes, present.
Lamont Badru? Eddie Mae Barnes?
Here.
Eliot Cherson?
Here.
Kenneth Finger?
Here.
Alicea-Santiago?
Here.
Tamara Stewart?
Present.
Elsa Rubin? Present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. I also would like to recognize our counsels to this board, Chuck Lesnick and Peter Stecker.
Thank you, Elsa. And I also just want to, for the record, note, in addition to Barbara Henson videotaping this, the City of New Rochelle is also videotaping on that camera over there. They could not do it live streaming because there's a City Council meeting upstairs, so I am live streaming it on this Facebook, FaceTime, or whatever this is called. So
With technology advanced.
open and transparent meetings, yes.
Also our board reporter, Richard Araya, and of course Barbara Hansen, who's recording the meeting also. As most of you know, Chuck Lesnick is retiring at the end of this month, and he will be replaced by Peter Stecker. On behalf of this board, I want to thank Chuck for his service, his leadership, his commitment to all of us, and your advice. And on a personal note, I want to really thank you for all the support you have given me in my new role as the chair of this board. Your advice and your patience, it's very much appreciated.
It's been a pleasure. I get paid for doing the work. You guys get a tiny stipend, so you're virtual volunteers, and you put in a lot of work, and it's very much appreciative, and you're always thoughtful in your deliberations, and it's been great working with you. It's been great working with the new people. It's been you and Kenneth, Eliot, Eddie Mae, some of the people that were preceded me. It's been a great experience learning more about rent regulation, and you know, we got good owners that are hardworking, and we have good tenants, and it's never the bad folks that show up at these public hearings to speak. It's always the good folks that come, and it's been very rewarding hearing everybody's back and forth.
And on that note, we have a little present for you. And where's the card? Is the card going around?
It's right there.
Did you sign it, Tamara?
So it is true, by a vote of 7-1 with one abstention. Yeah, you can hold this for a second. All right. A Parker frame, since we take a fair amount of pictures, we'll be able to fill it. Hopefully we'll fill it with members of the board here.
Yes,
We'll do a picture after the meeting if we're all speaking to each other.
Yeah.
Very nice. Oh wait, this is full of picture. Here I thought that there was a picture. That's great. This is a picture of Jane Morgenstern's farewell, and it's very meaningful.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
that you will appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I also would like to thank all of you, the people who are here tonight, the owners, tenants, and members of advocacy groups who have taken time out of your busy schedules to be here, and especially those who have testified. We appreciate your contributions to our decision-making process. It's very important for us to have you here and to hear from you. So, on behalf of the board, I want to thank you all. And at this time, I'm going to ask Charles if he has any announcements.
I don't have any further announcements.
No. That's never. So,
Only to remind everybody that what happens tonight after we vote is that we'll come back in September to certify what we voted. And that will be what goes into place for the October 1st through September 30th cycle, and for the 2-year leases 2 years from that point. So this is our vote tonight, whatever we do, but it gets certified at the end in September.
so we will now proceed to hear the testimony of the owners and tenant. And I believe you have agreed who goes first, or you want to agree on that right now?
I have no problem going first, and then Ms. Stewart can go last on the rebuttal if she'd like.
Okay.
That's okay. Okay, am I on?
You're
You
on.
can do it from there, you can do it from there, whatever you prefer.
No, I'll do it from there is no good. I'll do it from here if it's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. Members of the board, I've been making a presentation for a guidelines increase for a good number of years, but this is a new era. The legislative change to the ETPA this weekend has made this board's decision more significant than ever before. First, let us remember that in the past years, as well as this year, most tenants did not complain about the rent increases, and the objections I remember hearing were as to the vacancy increases, or basically, occasionally, lack of maintenance. Of course, now we have a new ballgame, and I do not want to engage in hyperbole, but we believe that within a few years, I think you will see buildings comparable to the Bronx in the 70s, unless this board can see the light and avoid that by a reasonable increase on a yearly basis. First, let's look at the new legislation. As you all know from the prior speakers, it did the following. Number one, made rent regulation permanent. It never expires. Virtually eliminates the ability to ever remove a unit from ETPA. Repeals the ability to remove a unit from ETPA when the unit becomes vacant and is over the statutory threshold of $2,750. Repeals the ability to remove a unit from ETPA when the tenant's income is $200,000 or higher in the preceding 2 years. Now, of course, this protects those tenants who earn over $200,000 and have no need for affordable housing, and keeps a needy family from getting this housing even at a market rent. Next, it limits the owners who might want to use the unit themselves as their primary residence for tenants who have been there for 15 years. It repealed the so-called Vacancy Bonus, which allowed a landlord to charge up to 20%, and it's been 5, 10, 15, and 20 for over 4 years recently upon a vacancy. Now, there could be no increase on a vacancy, and therefore, the rent for a new tenant will be the same as the rent for the tenant who moved out. Repealed the so-called longevity bonus for tenants in residence over 8 years. Excuse me. Therefore, when a tenant who has been in occupancy for 30 years or 40 years moves out, the rent will stay the same no matter how low it is. Next, forbids this board from granting a vacancy increase, as it formerly did on occasion, or in fact a low rent guideline. It extends a rent overcharge look-back period from 4 years to 6 years, and essentially requires the landlord to keep rent records forever, with larger administrative costs to the landlord. It lowers the amount that can be charged for an MCI, a major capital improvement, to 1/168th for buildings of 35 units or less, and 1/180th for buildings of more than 35 units. And those MCIs have to be removed after 30 years from the rent base. Don't ask me how, but it's going to have to be done. MCIs cannot be more than 2% of the rent charged to the tenant, from 15%, which it was before. It limits now what qualifies for an MCI. As to individual apartment improvements, IAIs, which were generally used to modernize an apartment after a long tenancy, it caps the amount that can be spent on an IAI at $15,000 and limits the number of IAIs to 3 in 15 years. I am advised that you can't even renovate a bathroom these days for $15,000. It removes IAIs also from the rent after 30 years, another administrative nightmare. It eliminates the ability to even get an MCI if there are less than 25% regulated units in a building. It eliminates the ability of a landlord to refuse to rent to a chronic non-payer who has been in court, no matter how many times. It adds a month to the already cumbersome and lengthy eviction process for non-payment of rent, thereby causing more delay, more legal fees, and more lost rent to landlords. And these are only some of the cumbersome restrictions now placed on landlords by this recent legislation. Now, of course, no unit will ever be exempt from ETPA due to a vacancy or the income of the residents or the size of the rent. That income, which in prior years, the vacancy income, was the subject to repeated objections by tenants and forms the basis of the presentation by Ms. Roche, a member of the Mount Vernon Tenants Union, will no longer be available to landlords. Therefore, the so-called cost-to-income ratio is a thing of the past, because all the income that was used by landlords to renovate apartments on vacancy or install a major capital improvement or install an IAI or generally raise the rent of a building on a vacancy to provide funds for maintenance and repairs will be no more. That income is a thing of the past. In addition, just as one comment on Ms. Roche's presentation, 100% of the rents that she uses are the legal regulated rents, which I think we all know is fictitious, since a significant percentage of landlords give preferential rents. And her analysis as to the price of oil is also faulty, since it was predicated on figures that do not compute the facts. Oil prices will go up for landlords, as they now have to use number 2 oil, which is significantly more expensive than the number 4 or number 6. And if you've put in gasoline in your car recently, is it really a lower price? I don't think so. Given the substantial loss of income due to the new legislation, I submit that it is necessary for this board to grant a reasonable increase to avoid the NYCHA or the 70s Bronx situation of buildings not being repaired or abandoned or sustained and maintained with enough money to do so, since in the past, these monies came from either vacancies or MCIs or IAIs, all of which are virtually gone. There will be no more monies from vacancy decontrol. There will be virtually no monies from MCIs. There will be almost no more monies from IAIs. The only source of monies for the landlords to be able to run, fix, maintain, repair, renovate their buildings will be the increases granted by our board. And let's look at the figures. Excuse me, from the surveys. Looking at this year's charts, the income went up 0.2%, but the expenses went up 0.4%, double that of the income. If you look at the surveys last year, the income went up 0.7%, while expenses went up 2.8%, 4 times as much. For the 2 years, that is a compounded 9%, while it's under 1% increase in income and 3.2% increase in expenses. That means that the rate of increase in expenses is more than double that of the rate of increase of income. And this does not include the cost of a mortgage, which, as we heard, is not in the tables. And except for some of these family businesses owned for generations, who can buy real estate without a mortgage? Looking at the expenses, according to the testimony, fuel went up 18%, according to the survey rather. Fuel went up 18% in this survey after going up 12% the year before. That's over a 30% increase in fuel in 2 years. And we haven't even talked about going to number 2 yet. And since the county is requiring number 2, they will increase even more. These are real numbers, not fantasy charts and selective articles. And looking at the New York City price index, virtually the same market, expenses went up 5.5% from last year. Utilities also increased, looking at our survey, 7% over 2 years. Real estate taxes increased over 3.5% over 2 years, and that is virtually the largest item for most landlords. We heard from various landlords the following. Insurance up 55% in the last 5 years. Con Ed up 9.5%. Delivery costs tripled in the last 3 years. 2019 Yonkers taxes for county portion up 7.2%, and overall tax bill up 9.2%. In 10 years, the cost of water in Yonkers up 310%. The money that was used by landlords to meet these expenses with the minimal guideline increases, which totaled 6% for 1 year increases combined over the last 5 years. If you add up all the 1 year increases over 5 years, you get a total of 6%. And that's what our guidelines are. That's why we needed the vacancies, the IAIs, and the MCIs to do improvements, repairs, and maintenance. So when we had that limited amount of increase, what went down? Repairs and maintenance. When you look at the, again, percentage increase over the last 3 years' expenses, from 2016 to 18, it was 9%, 50% more than income and 4.27% compounded on the prior 4.3%. Expenses are rising with the landlords no longer having the safety net of vacancies, MCIs, and IAIs. The increase in expenses, as I've said, was 50% more than the increase in income. In terms of actual dollars, virtually every category of expenses went up. Members of the board, when we look at the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, it says that in order to establish guidelines as a board, we shall, and that word is mandatory, it means must, consider among the following things. Number 1, the economic condition of the residential real estate industry in the affected area. At this time, the economic condition in the industry is facing an absolute disaster. You can be sure that even with the larger percentages required for co-oping, there will be many more units going that path to avoid the crushing effects of this legislation. We already hear that landlords will leave low-rent apartments vacant rather than have the burden and cost of a tenant in a below-market rent. And as to affordable housing, we heard on the radio yesterday that the Durst organization is ready to kill a 2,500 unit development at Willets Point, which has 500 affordable units, rather than put up with ETPA after the expiration of the 421 benefits. This will drive even more landlords to sell or abandon their properties. You heard from Mr. Solari, who sold his buildings. Other small owners have said they work 2 jobs to keep their buildings going, and they do not even invoice for a management fee, since they operate the buildings by themselves and it's sweat equity without formal management. Number 2, fuel, real estate taxes, and utilities. As I've said and I've shown you, these have gone up substantially, and you as members of the public know this. Moreover, the phony 2% real estate tax cap is a farce. Communities such as New Rochelle, where we are now, made the cap by cutting out the library from the general fund and then cutting out garbage collection and charging a fee for both. This, of course, is not a tax. Really? Gross operating maintenance costs, union wages go up yearly. Costs, and we heard last year from Mr. Persanis that there was a 4-year contract with 3% a year increases. Cost and availability of financing. We've heard from several bankers active in this field that the new law will reduce property values and therefore reduce the amounts of mortgage money available. 5, overall supply of housing accommodations at vacancy rates. The charts show that TPA housing accommodations are going down and vacancy rates down also, making less units available for young families. With the new legislation, we can presume that no one will ever move out. Why should they? Their rent will stay stagnant forever, enabling the tenants, many of whom are not Social Security recipients, but rather those who have summer homes in vacation communities or winter homes in Florida, to stay in their ETPA housing forever with succession rights to their children or grandchildren. The sixth factor, relevant data from current and projected cost of living. Cost of living always goes up, and over the years has gone up more than our increases. And seven, finally, such other data as may be available to it. Now we're talking data, excuse me again, not anecdotal matters, real data, figures, computations, etc. The data that is in our surveys that I have pointed to. Once again, you should consider that the county is requiring all landlords to switch to number 2 fuel. I must repeat, as I've done in past years, that the economic and social ills, lack of adequate income, and failure of our government representatives to provide adequate subsidies and funding is not the landlord's fault, or the tenant's fault, or the landlord's problem, or the tenant's problem. It is a government issue. And we look at all the communities that don't give, as I've said, the maximum of screen-and-dree, and there's really no rationale or reason for that. If there's any fault here, we should get in touch with our representatives and not expect landlords to subsidize the housing industry. Ms. Mayor, the state senator who rails against rent increases yearly, cannot point to one single piece of legislation that she has sponsored that provides affordable housing. We have screen-and-dree, as I've said, that are not even taken full advantage of by our communities. This year, we've had very few tenants testify, except of course those in Ms. Stewart's complex, but had numerous individual landlords testify. What we did learn was that if we want the landlords to provide properly maintained and adequately repaired buildings, we have to give them increases. In 2013 to 2014, we had 3% for 1 year, 4% for 2 years. Thereafter, while it took some time to kick in, the repairs and maintenance went up and there were less complaints. In 16 to 17, we had 0 and 5, and the maintenance went substantially down in those years. In 2004, we had 3.5 and 4.5. In 2005, we had 4 3/4 and 6.5. In 2006, we had 3 3/4 and 5. In 2008, we had 4.5 and 6.5. And the sky did not fall. Apartments were maintained and housing was provided. As I've said, there's virtually no capital improvements that we can anticipate, or IAIs, with the 1/68th or 1/180th payback with a 2% cap. I ask that you consider the deleterious effects of the recent legislation that I pointed out, which virtually wipes out any income except for our board. And this board's guideline is it. The lack of this income and the low rents operate to retard maintenance, keep single-family and couples in large apartments that can be used by young families, reduce the quantity and quality of available and affordable housing. Since rent increases are restricted, landlords have less incentive to both maintain and improve their housing stock. The proof of this is that the years after substantial increase, maintenance goes up. We have less complaints. In actuality, rent controls and low rent guidelines have the perverse effect of actually creating less affordable housing and less housing for young families that we would like to have live in Westchester. Many tenants game the system and may remain in their controlled housing while, as we've said, have second homes and then use succession rights to deny young families affordable housing. The single-family homeowner is also detrimentally affected, as is the biggest business owner in the community with ETPA, because of the lower property value of ETPA housing with significant tertiary tax reductions. And who has to make up that money? The single-family homeowner and the condominium owner. Among other things, there are notable economists, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, who say that indefinite rent ceilings cause haphazard and arbitrary allocation of space and retardation of new construction and affordable housing. The so-called cost-to-income chart, which I've referred to, doesn't include mortgage amortization, doesn't include establishment of reserves for capital improvements, doesn't include expenditures for major capital improvements, doesn't include IAIs. And yes, it doesn't include, of course, profit, that horrible word. Remember, for many of these landlords, the limited profit, if any, is because they self-manage, and even the larger landlords who don't self-manage provide jobs for many of our citizens. Over the years, the increase in cost of living has outpaced rent guidelines. I think it's important that we understand that the cumulative effect of low increases, as I said, 6% over 5 years, you cannot survive as a landlord. You can't keep up with expenses. The undisputed fact, and we can agree, is that over 15 years, ETPA housing has decreased about 50%. This is a major reduction which would not have happened if there was affordable and reasonable rent increases. ETPA's artificial limitation on rents is a drag on not only the construction of new affordable housing, but also inhibits the maintenance of existing housing. If you have artificially low rents, you have less affordable and more co-ops. The condition of housing will deteriorate without the reasonable rent adjustments. Landlords have to have the money that this board can give it to keep pace with the cost of living, with repairs, with maintenance. You're not going to get new roofs. You're not going to get new boilers. You're going to have the money for patchwork. It's obvious. If we want people to invest in and improve the housing and have it affordable, we have to allow them to not only stay even, but to make a profit. As we've heard from multiple small landlords who either have family-owned or small building investments, is it un-American to earn a profit on your investment? If you can get a guaranteed return in a bank, why invest in real property? The failure to guarantee a reasonable profit will drive out the responsible landlords and leave us with people doing nothing but cutting corners to stay even. This doesn't help the landlords, and it doesn't help the tenants. The cost of rent control is borne by everyone, by the landlords, by the tenants, by single-family homeowners. It leads to housing shortages. In Cambridge and Boston, as I pointed out in the past, they eliminated the controls, and housing is more available now than it ever was. Over the years, as I've said, long-term tenants continue to stay in their apartments, reducing the availability of housing. New tenants have to look for either luxury housing or housing with much higher rentals. And that's what this new legislation is going to do. Landlords and tenants are in a symbiotic relationship. What's good for one is good for the other. The only fairness for both landlords and tenants is to equalize rents being collected so that the market will take over and there'll be a reasonable availability of apartments upon people being encouraged to invest in real estate. A reasonable rent increase will do this. I'm almost done. We must encourage, not discourage, investment. We heard from owners who want to provide housing, but are also entitled to make a reasonable profit. They can't do it at zero, and they can't do it even at the 2 or 3 we had last year, given the increase in expenses, cost of living, and the newly legislated limitation on other income. Expenses increase exponentially, and income barely increases. Let's look at generically the negative impact on rent controls and the small guideline increases. Inhibition of new construction, deterioration of existing housing, reduced property tax revenues, substantial administrative costs, reduced consumer mobility and lack of housing for young families, higher consumer entry costs, higher income households who are the ones that most benefit from rent controls. Thus, the landlords are caught in an ever-increasing cauldron of additional expenses, taxes, repairs, labor, insurance, maintenance, utilities, while the income is not increasing as fast. The result is less cash flow, less income, less profit, less money for improvement and upgrades, less money to keep the properties from leaving the housing market. With this new legislation, it'll be even tighter. Every year, we've heard the question as to why there's still landlords. Well, the answer is that at this rate, there won't be any, except for luxury housing that we read about, or those who have to cut corners to make ends meet. No one wants this. If you want to kill housing for those living in rent-regulated apartments, and kill the maintenance, and kill the repairs, the surest way is to provide a less than adequate rent adjustment. We ask that you consider the impact of the anticipated higher fuel costs, taxes, utilities, labor, water, and we believe that in order to approach breaking even, a 6% and 12% for 2 years is more than reasonable. I leave it in your hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I'd like to just hand this out. This is just a summary of the legal changes. Okay, so, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Finley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, Chairwoman, Chairperson. I knew I'd get it right eventually.
Just like I get your name, last name confused. We're even.
It's a tough name to confuse.
Ms. Tamara Stewart is next with her presentation.
Chairman Rubin, members of the board, Deputy Counsel Lesnick, incoming Deputy Counsel Stecker, and members of the public. As a new member of this board, I am honored to have this opportunity to speak on behalf of the tens of thousands of tenants residing in ETPA units within Westchester County. While tenants are still absorbing the implications of the sweeping changes that were enacted in Albany last week, and while we are relieved that our long-standing pleas for relief have finally been heard by elected officials, it remains to be seen if the Housing Stability and Tenant Protections Act of 2019 will be enough to rebalance the scales that have been drastically tilted in favor of owners for more than 2 decades. Given that owners and their advocates have threatened to sue to invalidate the new law, and there's no reason to believe that they won't litigate, tenants aren't likely to see the benefits of the new law in our rent statements for some time. Last night, owners testified that this board should pass whopping 6% and 12% guidelines increases to offset anticipated declines in their revenues because of tenants' win in Albany. They argue that such astronomical increases are warranted in order for them to maintain their buildings going forward, that some tenants have bad habits, and that this board is unnecessary because an algorithm could do it better. To these arguments, I respectfully respond that this board should ignore them. This body must follow its statutory mandate and focus on the data we received from the DHCR statisticians last week, combined with testimony regarding that data and owner net profits, and demographic information about poverty, wages, and housing affordability. What may happen in the future is irrelevant to enacting guidelines this year, and the current data clearly shows that, with continuing high net profits after expenses of 37% to 39% in each of the last 4 years, a rent freeze is in order. This body's decision on new rent guidelines should be in line with our mandate to preserve affordable housing while providing owners with a, quote, reasonable return on investment. 37% to 39% net operating income is far more than a reasonable return on investment, particularly when it comes at the expense of tenant affordability. While owners have fared well over the past 20 years, tenants' plight has become increasingly dire over the same period of time. According to this year's New York State Community Action Association poverty figures for Westchester County, 9.4% of our county's residents live in poverty. Exhibit A in your handout. And Feeding Westchester estimates that there are approximately 200,000 food insecure individuals among us, 60,000 of which are children, which is Exhibit B. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Westchester ranks 8th among New York's counties with the greatest number of people living in poverty. And there's Exhibit C, with almost 90,000 people struggling to survive. It is a logical conclusion that the majority of low-income families are renters, not homeowners. And it is also likely that many of them live in rent-stabilized apartments. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, NLIHC. Quote, across New York, there is a shortage of rental homes affordable and available to extremely low-income households, ELIs, whose incomes are at or below the poverty guideline or 30% of their area median income, AMI, end quote. NLIHC estimates that 70% of ELI renter households are extremely cost-burdened, spending more than 50% of their household incomes on rent. Exhibit D. Poverty-stricken tenants desperately need a rent freeze this year. As we heard at our Mount Vernon public hearing, the inability to pay rising housing costs is causing more and more of our fixed-income senior citizens to combine households or become homeless. Many senior citizens' sole source of income is Social Security. And the Senior Citizens League, a nonpartisan organization whose mission is to protect Social Security and Medicare benefits, claims that Social Security's cost of living adjustments, COLAs, lost 34% of their buying power between 2000 and 2018, which is Exhibit E. Furthermore, the League forecasts that roughly half of the 2020 Social Security COLA will be wiped out by the increase in Medicare Part B premiums next year. Exhibit. Income-constrained senior citizens desperately need a rent freeze this year. And what about working class tenants? Many of them are struggling too. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition's 2018 Out of Reach report, a minimum wage worker would need to work 99 hours per week to afford a one-bedroom apartment at fair market rent, FMR. That workload represents 2.5 full-time jobs just to keep a roof overhead. The NLIHC estimates that the average renter hourly wage is $24.23, which falls short of Westchester's estimated two-bedroom housing hourly wage of $32.44. It's in Exhibit G. New York State ranks 4th nationwide in terms of its two-bedroom housing wage. And Westchester is the 3rd most expensive area to live in New York State. This year's Massachusetts Institute of Technology's living wage calculation for Westchester County estimates that a single parent with one child must earn $31.32 per hour to support his or her family, or an annual income of $65,146 per year before taxes. That hourly rate rises to $40.87 per hour if the single parent has 2 children. That's $85,018 per year before taxes, and $54.24 per hour if that parent has 3 children, $112,813 per year before taxes. That's Exhibit H. Working class tenants desperately need a rent freeze too. It's clear that many of our neighbors, young, old, and in between, working and retired, are struggling to pay for rent and other basic necessities like food and medicine. Owner advocates argue that landlords' fuel, insurance, taxes, and maintenance costs have risen. Thus, a significant guidelines increase is in order. However, owners aren't the only ones whose costs are rising. Tenants' car and health insurance premiums are rising too, as are the costs of food, gas, and child care. Tenants have no one to shift our rising cost burden onto. Why should owners be allowed to shift theirs onto us? Genevieve Roche's methodical forensic analysis testimony last night made it clear that owners writ large continued for the 4th year in a row to make a more than adequate 38% return on investment on their properties, despite the dwindling number of ETPA units in their buildings. Overburdened tenants need and deserve some relief from relentless rent increases, particularly given the relatively high and unwarranted 2% and 3% increases that were passed by this board last year. Our elected officials recognize the plight that many tenants have been experiencing for years, and to their credit, they took corrective action to provide some relief to tenants. While the Housing Stability and Tenant Protections Act of 2019 should eventually help protect tenants from some of the worst abuses that some owners have used to inflate rents, there is still more to be done to protect ETPA housing, and no doubt owners will seek to delay and derail implementation. I would also like to briefly address the predictions made last night that good owners who maintain their buildings and are in this for the long haul will sell their buildings to real estate speculators, leaving tenants largely at the mercy of the most uncaring owners. To you and them, I say that I believe the opposite will happen. The provisions of the new law clearly aim to curb speculation in rent-stabilized housing by curtailing the abuses of vacancy bonuses, high rent and income deregulation, preferential rents, and never-ending MCIs and IAIs used for 22 years to push tenants out. Hopefully, the reduction in incentives to game the system will have the desired effect of curbing most of the artificial inflation of ETPA rents, and most speculators will lose interest in this category of housing. For the buy and hold owners who take care of their properties, they will retain the ability to maintain them. Owners will still be able to use preferential discounts to incentivize tenants to rent from them, and owners will still be able to collect MCIs and IAIs to recoup the actual costs for maintaining and improving their properties. Owners of rent-stabilized housing will continue to make a profit, although down the road, the level of profit may be more modest than in years past. But that won't be this year, and this is the only year we are addressing when deciding rates. In conclusion, it is this body's duty to base its decision on owners' self-reported data to the DHCR, and not owners' unproven predictions about future suburban blight if the board doesn't pass outrageous rent increases. Despite owners' increased costs, their return on investment last year remained quite healthy and steady, and last year's significant 2% and 3% rent increases remained baked into the base rents for continuing owner profits. Conversely, tenants' current distress is real, and a significant portion of tenants continue to be rent-burdened or severely rent-burdened. We need and deserve the immediate relief that this body can provide through freezing rents. Please pass 0% increases on 1- and 2-year lease renewals. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Now we'll move to rebuttals, if there are some.
Are you asking what? Is there a rebuttal? Yes.
Mr. Cherson, you have a rebuttal?
Yes, no, I'm just passing these out. Yeah. Members of the board, As an introduction to the new members of the board and the audience, I think it is important that you know who I am as far as my profession and experience in the housing field. By doing so, I think it will give you a greater perspective of my presentation tonight. I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I've been an attorney since 1979. I'm a senior partner of Hertz, Cherson and Rosenthal, a law firm based in Forest Hills. We are one of the largest firms in New York City, specializing and practicing housing law. We have 21 attorneys and a staff of about 35. I've also been counsel to the Bronx Manhattan Association of Realtors for the past 26 years. Our firm has attorneys every day in the New York City housing courts in Manhattan, Harlem, Brooklyn, Queens, and Bronx, sometimes Staten Island. I have also personally practiced in most of the Westchester courts since 1979, Yonkers, Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, White Plains, Portchester, Larchmont, Bronxville, Elmsford, Armonk, and others. Our firm represents a variety of landlords. We represent some of the largest multifamily owners and management companies, and smaller landlords with few buildings, and landlords with just one building and two family buildings. Some are owned by fairly large corporations, but many are owned by families who either inherited them or scrounged together the funds to purchase a small building which becomes their sole source of income to raise their families. We heard many of them testify as immigrants who came here for the American dream, and they put the money together in order to purchase a building, and you heard how they're suffering. I am not going to say that every one of my clients is a saint. You can't say that about any business. However, I can tell you that all of our clients, from large to small, cares about their tenants. They all strive to provide decent and safe housing for their tenants. No exceptions. In doing so, however, they need the funds necessary to maintain the buildings. The money comes from only these sources: A, rental income; B, personal funds; C, family funds; and D, loans from banks. As such, I hope that you can understand that this presentation is based on true life experiences that I have experienced during my career. Simply put, as Mr. Finger pointed out, the laws enacted last week are short-sighted and disastrous, and not just for the landlords. They are a disaster for the tenants. I know the tenant activists in the New York State Senate and Assembly and this board feel that this new law is some sort of payback for years of so-called pro-landlord laws of the past decades. This has been clearly stated by leaders in Albany and here in Westchester. When the political climate in New York State changed in 2018, with the resulting Democratic control of the New York State Senate, tenant advocates seized the unprecedented opportunity to take a meat axe to the rent laws and put into place every so-called, quote, so-called, unquote, pro-tenant piece of litigation that was on the shelves for decades. I doubt if anyone in Albany ever thought that 95% of these laws would pass, and importantly, be signed by the governor. And most unfortunately, Governor Cuomo sat on the sidelines and did nothing. Why he did that is a great question that I don't think anybody has an answer to. But unfortunately, they did. And now we are faced with a new set of laws that, unless overturned by the courts, and you can be sure that they will be challenged in state or federal court, will result in dire consequences for both landlords and tenants. The initial thoughts that these new laws will help tenants is false. The new laws are going to hurt tenants in the following ways. No more building-wide improvements due to the death of MCIs for new roofs, heating systems, elevators, windows, security systems, replumbing gas and water lines, etc. No more renovations in apartments such as new kitchens, bathrooms, floors, doors, etc. Any necessary repairs will be done with patches, Band-Aids, and spit. There is simply no money to do large-scale renovation or repairs. It's simple. There just isn't the money. Well, think about it. You have a new roof. A building needs a new roof. And the roofer comes up there, he says it's $2 million to do the whole roof. He says, well, I can't get an MCI for that anymore. I don't have $2 million. Where is he supposed to get this money? He can't get it anywhere. So there's a leak above apartment 6A. How much to fix the leak above apartment 6A? $20,000. All right, patch it up. And then you're gonna have patches and patches and patches. And that roof needs to be replaced, but it's not going to happen. The boiler is not going to be replaced. You heard yesterday from a gentleman, I don't know if he's here, who had contracts, signed contracts for 3 new elevators and various other major improvements. And what did he say? And I think he was a very credible witness. I don't think anybody can doubt that he's lying, telling the truth. He canceled them yesterday. My clients, and there's quite a few of them, they are canceling every single major improvement of the building. Every single one. You're talking about a lot of buildings and a lot of work that will not happen. And as a side problem as a result of that, there is going to be enormous amount of unemployment by the contractors. The carpenters, the plumbers, the painters, the plasterers, boiler people, roof people, etc. There's not going to be any work for them. The contractors are going to go out of business. They're going to lay off their people. Real estate was a major employer of middle-class people. It's gone. It's over. And this is all due to the elimination of vacancy increases, MCIs, and IAIs. Over the past few days, I've spoken to many of our firm's clients, both large and small. This is a summary of some of what they've said to me. I will sell any building I can, but there is no buyer for them. Even if I find a buyer, it would be at a fire sale number. The so-called buyers, if there is any, will be unable to obtain mortgages from the banks. Very few, if any, buildings are bought without a loan from a bank. The banks are going to look at this and they're going to say, you want us to lend you money? How are you going to show a profit? You can't. Your request for a loan is denied. So they are now going to be stuck with buildings that they no longer want to own. And I'm hearing this, and I know it came up last night, they are going to keep the vacant apartments empty. I've heard this from a multitude of landlords. They are not going to rent those apartments for, and I'm just using an example, last year it was a 2 or 3% increase. So a tenant was there in a 2-bedroom apartment for 25 years, they're paying $800. And in order to rent it at the current, these new rules, he would only get 2 or 3% increase for that apartment. They will keep it empty. They will wait and see what happens with the probable litigation. Because why shouldn't they? If the litigation is successful, they'll be able to get a lot more for that apartment. But if they rent that apartment now, even if the litigation is successful, that tenant has a right to live there forever as a rent-stabilized tenant. Other things that they've said is that they will not do the major repairs. They're just going to use patches and Band-Aids. And as I said, they're not going to rent the apartments. And it's not a joke. One of my clients says he can't sleep at night. They also say they're going to start non-payment cases in the first month. Most of our clients, most landlords, don't start a non-payment case until the second or third month that the monies are due. That's not going to happen anymore. They're going to, first month, because also the process has been extended for so long with a 5-day notice, a 14-day demand, and they're not going to agree to give tenants more time when they go to court because they need somebody who can pay the rent. If you have somebody who's not paying the rent, they've got to cut their losses and get somebody in there who's going to pay the rent. I know that you're hearing this from an attorney who makes his living representing landlords, as my colleague, Mr. Finger. And I want to present to you some statements from news articles which I have passed around. In the New York Times, this is not me talking anymore. In the New York Times editorial of June 10th, 2019, which was before anybody knew about the new act, the Times stated the government needs to make sure the owners of rent-stabilized buildings are earning a sufficient return so that real estate remains an attractive investment. The Real Deal, June 12th, 2019. The Real Deal is an industry publication, and it's not partisan, it's an objective publication. The title, Cuomo's rent regulation will destroy New York City's housing market. And it goes on to state, the governor, in promising to sign a dumb and destructive bill to immortalize rent regulation, a step that would keep tenants who pay artificially low rents in over 1 million apartments from ever going up, Governor Cuomo has basically told everyone else in the New York City to go to hell. That's their word. It makes it likely that no new apartment buildings will rise. It guarantees that existing ones will decay. It will make repairs and upgrades prohibitively expensive for landlords who must eke out puny profits from properties that require major reinvestment, but where they can't charge enough to pay for it. The, quote, progressives, unquote, in Albany and City Hall are 100% anti-progress. They have no grasp of how housing, or any, markets work. Or, if they have an inkling, they disregard it in favor of adhering to a socialistic concept of affordable housing for all, in quotes, which worked so well in the Soviet Union. Real Deal, June 14th, 2019. Now know about the new law. The title of the article, and you have it, is Brokers on Rent Law Proposal. This is going to harm tenants. One thing brokers agree on is that changes won't be good. The laws can make landlords less incentivized to renovate their buildings, which could put an end to the long-standing trend of revitalizing neighborhoods in New York. The restrictions on MCIs and IAIs would preempt many of New York's older buildings from getting the improvements they need. The cities could also see its budget shrink, given that so much of the revenue comes from real estate taxes. Property assessments could start to decrease under these new laws. A landlord whose building can't be sold, his value has gone down, is going to petition, whether it's the city of Yonkers, White Plains, Westchester County, New York City. They're going to say, my building is worth less, I should pay less taxes. And they're going to be successful. And there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of landlords doing the same thing. What is the result of that? There is less revenue coming into the municipality, whether it's the giant city of New York or the city of Yonkers. In addition to that, a huge source of income for the state of New York, the city of New York, and the municipalities is the taxes on closing. There is real property transfer taxes, and there are mortgage taxes. These are enormous sources of funding for the cities, for the municipalities, especially New York, but certainly up here as well. You're really setting us up for an environment, this is back to the article, you're really setting us up for an environment where our 80-year-old housing stock is not going to get the necessary improvements, which will hurt the tenants and set the cities up for budget reductions. June 14th, title is Don't Expect the Multifamily Market to Pick Up Anytime Soon, Brokers Say. These laws are likely will drive the prices down by reducing the incentives for investors to buy rent-controlled buildings in the first place. The new laws reduce the incentives for the private sector to invest in properties. June 14th, community banks already feel the squeeze of rent reforms. Where does a landlord get the money to buy a building? He goes to the banks. He seeks a mortgage. Quoting from the article, New York Community Bank, Signature Bank, and Dime Community Bank, which are three of the largest lenders of multifamily housing in the New York area, have lost a combined $2.5 billion, that's with a B, in market capitalization since the spring when the new laws became probable. Their stocks declined sharply on Wednesday when the proposed laws became known. The banks simply won't lend for refis or purchases or major repairs. It's simple. They're not going to do it. And they're also going to end up with a lot of buildings because if you don't pay your mortgage, they're going to foreclose. And this is the cycle we saw in the bad old days of the Bronx, Fort Apache, and not just the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, parts of Manhattan, all over, and Yonkers, and Mount Vernon, and New Rochelle. Nobody wants to go back to that, but that's what we're talking about. That is a real possibility. June 17th. Caps on IAIs and MCIs could spell disaster for landlords, lenders, and workers, real estate pros. This is quoting the article. There will be an increase in foreclosures if owners are not able to pay taxes and resolve violations if they cannot make the repairs. Staff will be laid off due to the lack of renovations. Contractors will lose tremendous business, leading to layoffs. Those affordable apartments won't look so nice. They're going to do what they have to, but they aren't going to do more. They're going to invest in something else. As we heard yesterday again, a gentleman, a landlord, was going to put in 3 new elevators and some other work. It's canceled. He's going to stick with the old elevator. It's going to stop. It's going to start. It's not, obviously, if he wanted to replace it, there was a good reason. June 18th, I think that's today. Analysis. Here's what the new rent law will do to the average stabilized apartment. I'd ask you to read that. It goes through all the numbers. And at the end of that article, it states, the removal of vacancy deregulation means that landlords no longer have a clear end goal when attempting to raise rents. At this point, under the new rules, a hypothetical landlord has basically used up all the available tools to increase rent beyond any, and they use 3% RGB increase for approved rents. As Mr. Finger stated, it's not hyperbole. This is not scare tactics. This is the real new world brought to us by the 150-mile city of Albany from here. If you don't enact substantial increases, the results will in fact be a dire effect for both landlords and tenants. I'm almost done. I just have one comment to make about Ms. Stewart brought up affordability. And we hear that a lot, obviously. We've been hearing that for many years. But the word affordability does not appear in the statute, in the ETPA, which sets forth the grounds under which we are to enact increases. There is nothing in there about affordability. The word does not exist. It should not be considered by this board. And I would request that this board enact the increases as suggested by Mr. Finger of 6 for a 1 and 12 for a 2. This is to maintain the property. There is no other source of income anymore. This is it. It's come down to this body, the Rent Guideline Board in the New York City, Rockland, Nassau County. That's it. That's what they've done. You know what? Albany politicians, they're famous for this. They kick the can down the road. They kicked it right here to this table. And it's up to us to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cherson. Ms. Stewart, do you have a rebuttal to that?
Yes, I do. Members of the board, what Mr. Finger calls cumbersome restrictions of the new laws is simply the reality that the 22-year party of gaming the system is over. Talk of individual expenses to owners is irrelevant. Profit has stayed at the same level for the past 4 years and is likely to be the same in 2019. I do note that the facts presented regarding oil are not fantasy fake facts. Genevieve's information is from the U.S. and New York government energy agencies, and as far as conversion to number 2 oil is concerned, that is the fake fact. Check out the New York City Clean site that discusses in detail how the conversion reduces operating expenses. Cost to income ratio is not a thing of the past, unless what owner reps mean is that the relationship of cost to income, for example, profit, is meaningless, unless that ratio is at the level of 38%. And for the record, rent regulation is not a subsidy nor an artificial limitation on housing. Indeed, it is the owners who are subsidized by the emergency situation created by the lack of supply that inflates rents beyond a normal market. Claiming that owners can't make a reasonable profit when they have consistently made in the 30% range several years running is nothing short of ludicrous. Owners say that rent increases are wiped out now except for guideline increases. That is not true. MCIs and IAIs still exist, but will be capped once actual expenses recouped after 22 years of gaming the system. Owners don't need an incentive to improve apartments. They are required to maintain their buildings. They just don't want to dip into their high level of profits to do so. Debating the pros and cons of rent regulation.
Ms. Stewart, can you, excuse me, the audience, please, you have to remain silent. If you want to have conversations among yourself, you can step out and have that, but please respect the speaker.
Thank you. Debating the pros and cons of rent regulation is not the province of this board. And the effects of the new laws won't be felt in 2019, and that is the only year that we are here to discuss. After 22 years, tenants are entitled to 1 year, this year, when owners will still reap prior levels of profits, to wait and see what the effects of the new legislation will be. The facts and analysis are clear. This year, based on these facts, as well as based on the aberrational result of last year's unwarranted 2 and 3% increases, a freeze is warranted this year. What happens in future years, the board will face when that time comes.
Can I make a quick response?
Well, we could be here the whole night
No,
waiting
just
for.
really
Very
could.
quick, I'm asking you.
Yes.
You stated in your presentation that the effects will not be, you will not feel the effects in the year 2019. That is simply not true. The effects have already happened. It has happened now. There are leases out there for new tenants that are not being signed. There are plans to do new bathrooms, kitchens, etc. that won't happen. There were plans to put in new elevators and roofs and boilers, etc. in buildings in the year 2019. They will not happen. All of that is over. I know you probably don't believe me, and I respect that, but I know for a fact, speaking to my clients, that they will not do MCIs, they will not do IAIs, they will not rent apartments, they're not going to do repairs, and they're going to find bubble gum to put on that leaky pipe over here. And that helps nobody. Thank you.
May I respond, ma'am?
Sure.
Thank you. If there are effects for 2019, they'll show up in the numbers that we get from the statisticians next year. The numbers we're supposed to be looking at are the ones they presented to us last week. And all that stuff you're talking about is not in those numbers, where the return on investment is 38%.
We have to live in a real world.
Excuse me, and for any of the tenants who live in those buildings where the owners are choosing not to live up to their obligation to provide required services, I will be more than happy to help them fill out the HCR paperwork to file for the relief that they deserve, because if they're not getting the services that they're paying for, there is redress for that. So if the owners choose not to fulfill their obligation to provide the services that tenants are paying for, they can come and see me and I will help them do that. The owners who are doing what they're supposed to do have nothing to worry about. But you're projecting something into the future that is totally irrelevant to the conversation that is the subject of the discussion today.
We'll have to agree to disagree.
I'm going to ask the members of the board if they have any questions or comments. Okay, if there are no questions or comments, we're going to take a brief recess and we will reconvene here to take the final vote. 5 minutes.